Hey, everybody. This is the first episode of Not Another Bible Study. It is, of course, a Bible study. But unfortunately, YouTube isn't allowing me to go live on that channel directly at least for like another 24 to 48 hours. So, what we're going to do is go live here on ECG on the Facebook page, and I can upload this later. So, you'll be able to share this from YouTube probably later this evening. But the joy here is, we'll be streaming live every week here and then on YouTube as well. So whatever's most convenient for y'all, we'll have access to. Secondly, you can ask questions. This isn't designed. Obviously, if you're watching live, if you're watching it recorded, that's not going to work out. But you can ask questions as we go. This is not supposed to be just me talking to you. This is a conversation. I want to hear your questions. I want to hear your comments. And today's episode is going to be a little short because I just want to introduce the book of Revelation. There's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of questions people have before we even get into it, both how it's written, where it comes from. I kind of want to nail some of those things out so that we can, as we go through, we can sort of flesh out a lot of these concepts. Probably the first thing I would like to mention, I got to switch over my thing here so I can actually see your comments if you have any questions, is when was it written and by whom? There is some debate on this. Most commonly is accepted it was written around the mid 90s AD. And the reason for this is the testimony of Irenaeus. He's one of the early church fathers. He wrote about that. He said that Paul was writing at the end of Emperor Domitian's reign. Several other writers sort of confirm this, though there's some question as to whether or not they were getting that information from Irenaeus as well. So if Irenaeus was wrong, it's possible they were wrong in their confirmations. However, by and large, everyone seems to agree with that. But there is, like I said, there's some controversy because some people will claim that it was actually written prior to 70 AD, that John was writing prior to the destruction of the temple. One of the reasons for this is that when John, in the book of Revelation, chapter 12 specifically, is asked to measure the temple by the angel, we'll get to it. I don't want to get caught up in the details yet. Um, he doesn't make any comment about the fact that the temple had been destroyed, right? It didn't say, "Hey, I saw a rebuilt temple." It was just the temple for him. So a lot of people, and also the same thing with the Gospel of John. The thesis is that John the Apostle is John the Revelator. I think we're gonna, particularly when we get into that first chapter of Revelation, we're gonna see some really good reasons for that to be the case. For now, we'll just take it as they probably are the same person. And again, most people would argue that Revelation and the Gospel were sort of written at the same time or similar times. I think it's pretty obvious that at least the final version of John's Gospel is very influenced by what he sees in the in what he recounts in the book of Revelation. Again, we'll get into that once we get into chapter 1. We're going to go through. There's some really interesting things that get pointed out. I think I would even argue that it's entirely possible that the reason he writes his gospel is because of what he sees in Revelation. I think that really informs very much, which is why his gospel is so dramatically different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Right? They all had slightly different intentions, but there was a point they were making. But John's point is so radically different. I think it's because of what he encountered here, in these visions and with these prophecies. I think, as you'll see, there's definitely he's right. I think it's a pretty solid argument that he's writing afterwards. Well, the reason that's important in this whole chain of events is, again, in John's gospel, he never says, "Hey, temple was destroyed," right? He doesn't. He doesn't point to the fact that it happened. So, which we would have assumed he would do had he written after the destruction of the temple. So if he's writing this in, say, 65 AD or 66 AD, then it's entirely possible that he Again, the reason he doesn't mention the temple destruction is because it hadn't happened yet. Unfortunately, it's at this point it's going to be kind of hard to say yes or no which way to go. Some people point that Irenaeus claims that Jesus was closer to 50 years old when he was executed rather than the traditional 33. So that's why that's one of those little things that people throw in there as a way of condemning Irenaeus' claim that John was writing towards the end of Domitian's reign. However, it's something we'll deal with later on um, when we get to Revelation 12, is that there's some good evidence that Jesus was not born in year 1 or 0. He may have actually been a little bit older when he was, the general thought is, well, he was born in 1 AD. Maybe, some people may push it back to 2 AD or 2 BC, and then he's 33 when he dies, and it's 33 AD is when it happens. Um, that's entirely possible. That it was 33 AD. I don't think he was 50, but I do think he may have been a little bit older than what we give it. I think there's reason um, from astronomical signs and alignments that are recounted and will be mentioned in the Book of Revelation that there's some good evidence for Jesus to be older than the 33 years old that we often sort of think of him at his crucifixion. So the point here is there are two arguments as to when the book was written, and of course, I would argue that John the Apostle is John the Revelator, but there's some people who argue that's not quite the case. Um, I think the argument against John the Revelator and John the Apostle being the same people are kind of weak. And like I said, once we really get into chapter 1, we're going to see why. There's some really substantial um, overlaps between John's gospel and Revelation, and I think it's clear that his final version of his gospel comes after Revelation. We'll see it. So at least moving forward, I wanted y'all to be aware of sort of that argument on both sides, and the fact that there is some controversy. I would, as we go on, anytime there's controversy or some question, I am going to address both sides. I don't want you to walk away thinking, okay, well, this is what I have to believe. I'm going to tell you what I believe. I'm going to tell you why I believe it. And I'm going to tell you what I'm reading. And I will give you facts. I'll give you history. You have to make up your mind. That's it. You can completely disagree with me. That's great. That doesn't mean that I don't want you here. I want us. There needs to be that conflict, right? There needs to be some pushback. We need to understand all the sides of these coins sometimes. And that leads me to the second point, which is there are four great perspectives on how the book of Revelation is read. What I'm meaning that there are four families of thought, right? The first is probably just the easiest to kind of do away with, and that's the preterist view, which is the view that everything talked about in the book of Revelation was wrapped up in 70 AD. Some may say, well, okay, well, maybe there's this last little piece here at the end, but basically by 70 AD, the book's done. That's it. There's no, which often is adopted by people who are all millennial, believing there is no millennial reign of Christ. The second is sort of, well, okay, I probably did this out of order. The first, we'll say so the first one's the preterist. The second one's the idealist. The idealist is one that says all of it's metaphor, right? It has no historical value. Whereas the preterist would say, yes, it was prophecy and it was about real events, but those events have all come and gone and we're done. The idealist view says everything's a metaphor. It's just a larger conversation about God versus Satan, good versus evil throughout history, and it's all metaphor. Don't take it literally. It is simply a work to educate us about the work of God and about what we should be doing. It's not anything to base your life off of. The third view is I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but it's the historistic. We'll just call it the historic view. And the idea here is that you could track all of what we call the church age, right? Everything from 33 AD to now tracks on a timeline that is created by the prophecies, right? This is really really favored by those who like to claim that the Catholic Church is the system of the Antichrist, that the popes have all been the false prophets. Basically, what they do is they say they take that 1280 days that's mentioned in the book, the 3.5 years. It's like, well, hold on, a day is a year, a day is a year, so that's 1280 years. And I'm not going to say that that viewpoint doesn't have some legitimacy to it. I think there's some points where we can discuss it, but really to make that work, there's some textual gymnastics you kind of have to do. The fourth and uh, the fourth great version is what's called the Futurist View, which is pretty obvious. It just states that the Book of Revelation is a prophecy, is a book of prophecy about the deep future. Some would argue that we're in that time frame now, or at least getting close to it. So that those are the four basic views. Where I fall is I think we actually have a bit of everyone's right, except for the idealist view. The book is a book of prophecy. I do believe that we do have to take it from the perspective of people who were living at the time. I do think that because as we see in the letters, right? So we have an introduction, then we have the 7 letters to the 7 churches, then we have the broader prophecies that most people are concerned with. A lot of things mentioned in the letter to those 7 churches or things happening then, right then and there. So I don't think we can reject that aspect of it. I do, in fact, I think that the reason there's some things, like for example, the numbers 660 and 6. A lot of people have pointed out that Nero's name calculates to 666 if you use gematria. There's also a codex that includes the Book of Revelation that was written in Greek, found in I want to say it was Egypt, and that version doesn't say 660 and 6. It's a slightly different number. It's like 640 something. I may be wrong, but it's just not six. It's not the 666 we're all familiar with. And a lot of people have pointed out that, well, if you take Nero's name from a particular way, there was another way it was written, it calculates that the same way. So what they were doing was sort of saying it's clearly Nero that they're talking about. I would argue, yes, Nero is is sort of one meaning of that. But the thing is, so to a point, I think that there is some validity to that sort of a semi-historic, semi-preterist view where there are aspects of the Book of Revelation that were intended for that time frame. But I also think, in a broader sense, that was very limited. The idea was, as we see all throughout the Old Testament, a lot of prophecies had sort of an immediate fulfillment, but they were very clearly not. That's not what the prophecy was really about. In fact, one version or one example of this we're going to see very clearly, um, once we get into the Book of Revelation, is Isaiah. Now, this is going to be a little controversial, but in Isaiah 14, where it talks about Lucifer, he's not talking in those 2 chapters. He's not. I don't think Isaiah the prophet's really talking about. It's talking about the fall of Babylon. Let me just give you some context on that. So the first chapter is about the fall of Babylon, the city, and then the second chapter, which is 14, I believe, is about the destruction of the king of Babylon, who is named Lucifer. Obviously, the fall of Babylon and the death of the king all occurs in several hundred years before Christ comes. So that's all there, right? No big deal. No controversy. But it's pretty obvious from the text that that's not what's really being talked about. So yeah, it's a prophecy against Babylon, but it's really not against Babylon. Again, we'll go way more into why, but for now, let's just suffice to say that I would argue that the what's happening there is it's really about a prophecy against Babylon the Great that we see fall in the Book of Revelation. That the Antichrist is Lucifer. We'll argue all that later. Just for now, let's set the table here. So in the same way, I think that the elements of the Book of Revelation that you could say, well, hey, this is all happening in, around the first and second centuries, and some things here that really kind of map out for the rest of the next 2,000 years. I think that has validity. I don't think that is should be rejected out of hand. I do think that was absolutely a component to why the Book of Revelation was written. But I am a futurist. I do think that it will all fully play out as described in the Book of Revelation very, very soon, really soon. And I will have to say, I think there's a valid argument to be made that I'm not going to say that I completely believe that this is the case, but I think there is a solid argument to be made that some of the trumpets may have already blown. We'll go into why. Again, we're just sort of setting up the table here. But that's sort of the thing. There are these, again, those were the four different views: the idealist, the preterist, the historical view, and the futurist view. And again, mine is, I think two of those at least have some value, but I think the fulfillment is the final one. It's the futurist view. I do believe that there will be a literal millennial kingdom. I think it's all written in the Old Testament. It's clearly written at the end of Revelation. So I do believe that is something that's going to come. We haven't hit it yet, but we will, again, pretty shortly. The other two big things I think I want to mention real quick is that there's two keys to understanding the Book of Revelation. This episode is going to be a little short for this. I don't want to belabor too many points. Like I said, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them. But I think so. We've kind of set up with where and when it's happening, when the book was written, and these are all in the different views, and these are important. But I think one of the reasons that this book has remained so controversial and difficult to understand is sort of for three reasons. One, yeah, there we are, three reasons. The first is, like so many prophecies, you're not really meant to understand it until you kind of get to it, until you're like, oh, here's how we see it playing out. I think that throughout history, the problem is you try to interpret it with where you are at the time, right? Well, if you lived 500 years ago, obviously the end of the world wasn't 500 years ago, but because here we are. And yet people said, well, it's now. This is what's happening now. So we often have tried to interpret it from that viewpoint. And the problem is then that viewpoint gets taught and it gets moved and people just, kind of reshuffle it around. So the last sort of great move into the Book of Revelation, from a theological perspective, was post World War II, right? A lot of the teachers coming out of that's during the American-Russian Cold War, and so that really has, and again, a lot of the teachers were Protestant. So I think that flavored a lot of what was going on, and so we've inherited a lot of those teachings, a lot of those thoughts. And it's only now that the world is sort of shaking out in a particular way. You're like, oh, whoa, hold on. It looks like we got some things wrong here. We'll talk about that as we go. So that's definitely. So I think that's the one thing is I think the reason is we've been trying to make it fit the time that we were living in the past without realizing, hey, the Bible's very clear about a few things, but it doesn't. But the problem is it didn't make sense to them at the time, so they spiritualized it, or they made other metaphors out of it, or they said, well, maybe he must really be talking about this. So we'll get into that further. The second key, just again, there were three keys or three issues. I think the second key is when it comes to the metaphor, to the imagery that we see in the Book of Revelation, we've tried to make it up on the go, right? We're trying to say, well, yeah, there's definitely some imagery borrowed from other books, but it's sort of its own thing, without realizing that no, it's not that at all. There is a cipher. The Bible's usually really good about giving us ways to decode things. And I would argue that the Book of Revelation, there's a scene in the Book of Revelation and in the Book of Daniel that connects them intimately. And when you compare the symbology used and the visions used in both, it becomes clear that Daniel and Revelation are in many ways the same book, just told in two different parts. Or at least some of the visions from Daniel are. And for me, what that tells me is the visions that are explained in the book of Daniel are the codes. That's the cipher we need to understand what's being said in the book of Revelation. Now you may be saying, whoa, what, how, okay, sure, maybe the codes are there, but how, what scenes connecting the two books together, and how can you say they're one and the same? I have it all written down because I don't remember things very well. That's why I write books. It's much easier to just go back and reread something and try to remember it. Anyway, so in Daniel 10, this is the scene where he's been praying for 21 days, right? And what's happened is, he's been praying and fasting, but the angel that or the spirit rather, what they call the prince, that is over Persia, was preventing this angel, this glorious angel, from coming and all that. So he's been, so Michael goes and he goes to help him. Well, so he finally goes and talks to Daniel for a good long while and gives him a bunch of visions of the future. Well, the interesting thing here is, so again, Daniel 10, he describes this glorious angel as wearing linen, right? Just this pure white linen. He's just glowing. It's awesome. He's terrified. And so this vision of this glorious man, he's telling him all these things. But then at the end, we go through chapter 10, then 11, then we get to chapter 12. And this is something we're going to come back to in the future, and we're going to talk a lot about this one. But for now, we'll just keep it in the back of your head. But at that time, meaning the time when what many people believe is the Antichrist, shall plant his tent between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, which is Jerusalem. He shall come to his end, and no one will help him. Well, in these days, meaning this time frame, right? Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. Even to that time, and at that time, your people shall be delivered. Everyone who is found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust in the earth shall awake. So again, this is the tribulation. We have the resurrection. All that's talked about here. We jump down to verse 4. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Okay, let me give you a little foreshadowing here. That's important because a lot of people would argue that the scroll that Jesus breaks when he breaks the seven seals, that is the scroll. That's the prophecy that the angel is talking to Daniel about. That Daniel's literally the one who sealed them. We'll go into more detail, but just give you a little foreshadowing. Verse 5. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others, one on this riverbank and the other on that riverbank. So let's take a moment here. Chapter 10, angel in linen shows up. He's been talking for the last I guess really 3 chapters, 10, 11, 12. So the last 3 chapters is pretty much all this angel giving him prophecies and telling him, like, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. He sort of gave him his last little prophecy about Michael and the end times and the resurrection. And he's like, close this thing up. And now Daniel's like, hey, hold up. You're there. There's a dude over there, and there's a dude over there. So there's now 3 angels, or let me rephrase this, 3 people that he's looking at. One's the glorious angel. Then we have 2 guys in robes standing on either side of this riverbank. And this is really what's important is verse 6. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? So again, the glorious angel, he's above the water. One of these 2 figures is talking to the guy and is talking to this glorious angel. How long is this going to take? And when will this be? Then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, Thou shalt be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. Although I heard, I did not understand. And then I said, this is Daniel speaking, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Then we go to the rest of it. It's worth reading, but our purpose here is, so there's this scene. Daniel is taking information down from the angel. Then all of a sudden, two other people show up, and they have this completely separate conversation with this angel. And Daniel's just watching it. He's sitting there all by his lonesome, and it's like the angel's talking to him. And he's like, "Oh, let me go talk to these other two guys for a second." And then Daniel's butting back in. He's like, "Hey, hold up, my vision, my prophecy. What the heck's going on here?" And he's like, "Don't worry about it. Just finish writing your book and move on." Okay, so how does this connect to the book of Revelation? Ahem. Well, let's fast forward here to Revelation chapter 10, coincidentally. And so John has just gone through the first six. So he's gone through the seals, and now we've come to the trumpets, and he's finished the sixth trumpet. And then there's this pause. We'll explain why that exists momentarily. But there's a pause. And then we start chapter 10. And it says, I, John, saw still another mighty angel coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud. Clouds are white, just like linen. And a rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun, and his feet like the pillars of fire. Very similar to the description of the angel from Daniel. He had a little book open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. So again, he's over the sea, he's over a body of water, and he cried with a loud voice, as when a lion roars. When he cried out, seven thunders uttered their voice. I'm going to jump ahead because the point here is he hears these seven voices, these seven thunders, and the angel literally tells him, "Don't write that down. No one's supposed to know what that is." Which, I'm sorry, if I can take just a second. That's one of those things that's always sort of bothered me is we try. Again, I'm someone who's written about prophecy, and one of the things that even I don't spend enough time talking about is the book of Revelation is designed to be a little mysterious, and we see it right here, where it's like, we're not telling you what this is. And we don't know why. We don't know why we're not supposed to know what the seven thunders are, but we don't. So, all right. So we just have to realize some of this stuff we're just not going to understand until it happens. That's life, as they say. So we're going to jump down and to verse 5. The angel whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised up his hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are on it, the earth, the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, that there should be a delay no longer, but that in the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God would be finished, and he declares, as he declared to his servants, the prophets. So what he's talking about there is the seventh, is after this little interlude, we're going to have the seventh trumpet blown. But note the similarities. John, who's being guided by an angel, and we see that a little bit later on, they're going through doing things. Then this other angel shows up, and what do we have? We have two guys, Daniel or John, his angel, and this mighty angel, and they're having conversations. Very, very similar here. I would argue this is the same. This is the scene. Now Daniel's recording his version from his perspective. John's writing about his conversation with the angel. I would argue these are the same scene, right? Daniel's writing it from his perspective, John from his perspective. It's the same event. That means both of these books are intertwined. Now, that the importance for that is when we go back through the book of Daniel, we see lions, as it's supposed to symbolize a nation with wings, with eagle's wings. It's ripped off and it stands up and has the heart of a man. We have a bear. We have that with ribs in its mouth. We have a four-headed leopard with four wings, and we have this other beast. We have a mountain, which is a symbol for the empire of the kingdom of God. We have all kinds of really interesting imagery in the book of Daniel that is absolutely repeated and referenced in the book of Revelation. I would argue that whatever symbology is borrowed from Daniel has the same meaning. Now, this becomes important when we get to some of the prophecies. For example, one of the trumpets, it talks about a burning mountain being cast into the ocean. People from around, theologians have said for a very long time that this must be an asteroid. I'm not going to say it's not an asteroid. What I am saying, though, is the language is really specific. I think we have to look to Daniel on this. And because that imagery of mountains being kingdoms is not just found in Daniel, it's found later in Revelation. So I think when it talks about a burning mountain that's thrown into the ocean, I think what we're talking about is an empire. That we'll go into more detail, but my point is, Daniel is the cipher for understanding some of the more mysterious and odd parts of the book of Revelation. Now we come to the third and final key, and this is going to be the weirdest one. But it's something we're going to have to kind of really just sort of break down here. And that is, the book of Revelation is not written in a linear perspective. I think this is the number one problem a lot of people have, is they try to make the book of Revelation linear. Like God just took John, sat him in front of a television and was like, watch this. And it's beginning, middle, and end. And that's not what's happening. Now, that's not my idea. Lots of people have had this thought. They've noticed that often that it seems like what we have are nesting dolls, like the little Russian nesting dolls. Like I have one right here, actually, right? Because once we get through the introduction, then we get to the 7 letters, John's taken up, and we have the seals, right? And we knock through all the seal prophecies. But then what happens with the 7th seal? Oh, look, we have trumpets now. And then once we get through the trumpets, what happens at the end of the trumpets? Oh, look at that. We have bowls, right? And then mixed in and about all of these differing sets of prophecies, we have these weird interludes. Some are short, some are long. Most of them exist outside of the sequence of events, but some occur within. So the book is clearly not written in a linear fashion. And if you still don't believe me, you should always go back to the book. This is just my notes. Let's look at Revelation 8, verse 5. So what's happened is all of the seals have been broken. Now we've come to the 7th seal, and it talks about the angels being given the trumpets. Well, then we get to verse 5, and it says, the angel took the censer. So the angel that had broken the last seal has handed out the trumpets to everybody. The angel, so that's the angel, then took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. So again, 7 angels are given it. One of the angels who's involved with everything takes the censer, fills it with fire, throws it to the earth. Again, lightning, there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. We jump ahead to Revelation 11, chapter 19, or chapter 11, verse 19. So again, 7th trumpet has sounded. Then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of the covenant was seen in his temple. And there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, and an earthquake, and great hail. So all the same things that occur, but now there's hail. Then we jump ahead to 16, verse 17. Now, again, what's happened? All of the bowls have been poured out. So everything's done, right? All the bowls are poured out. And then let's start with verse 17. Then the 7th angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple, again, temple, Where were the 7 angels? Temple. What was in at the end of the trumpets? Ark of the Covenant, which was in the temple, which was open. Now, a voice comes out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, "It is done." And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as has not occurred since men were on the earth. Now that great city was divided into 3 parts. That's some believe that to be Jerusalem, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found, and great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. Men blasphemed God because of the large plague of hail, since that plague was exceedingly great. So again, it's the 7th bowl that's poured out, and we have the same thing: noises, thunders, lightnings, a massive earthquake, hailstones, just like the rest of them. And you may say, well, how do we know these things don't happen like 2 or 3 times? I mean, the tribulation is crazy. Okay, valid point. So let's do a little cross-referencing here. In Revelation, again, 16, but verse 20, it says, "Then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found." Okay, it's a pretty significant event. Let's go back, shall we, to chapter 12. I'm sorry, chapter 6, verse 12. So the 6th seal. What happens in the 6th seal, right? He opened the 6th seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair. The moon became like blood. All the stars of heaven fall to the earth as a fig tree drops to its figs when it's shaken in a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. Let me repeat that. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up. So again, this is seal 6. The sky's gone. Sky disappears. And every mountain and island was moved out of its place. And the kings of the earth and great men, rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man hid themselves in the caves and the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide from us the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who is able to stand?" That's the exact same event. 6th seal has at least parts of it. Again, we're going to go into more detail, but at least aspects of this 6th seal prophecy is clearly the 7th bowl. Same thing. So, what does this mean? What it means is each of these events, right, or each of these series of 7, the 7 bowls of judgment, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 seals, all have the same ending point. But they all have different perspectives and different uses. Like I said, some people have argued that it's like a nesting doll, right? One opens the other. That I would not argue is not correct. I would not argue that isn't correct. I think that's a very valid point. But I would point to something a little different. Comic books. Give me a second. Trust me on this. When Marvel Comics first started publishing, right? Or really, let's jump back to the beginning of comic books. When comic books first started to be created, it was the first time really that you could have stories that continued multiple months. Because prior to the 20th century, if you had what were called these old sort of pulp or dime store novels, but they were complete stories. They had to be, because you couldn't control when everyone got them. But by the time the 20th century rolls around, you had better distribution. So yeah, you could get a monthly comic, right, every month. And you could get some, you get comic A, and then you can get comic B, right, the next month. So you could tell a story that took several issues, something that's never been done before. And then Marvel comes along, and they start to intertwine their universe a lot more than what other people had done, right? And what that ends up being is now you start having these intricately told stories. Something could happen in Punisher that affects Power Pack, and then the Fantastic Four deal with it over here, and the X-Men deal with it again, and then Spider-Man has to deal with it. Well, you have all these different characters and things, and it's all one big story, but you had to get all the issues. Well, eventually, we jump up to an event called Civil War, and they've done some other things up to that point, but then you get to Civil War, and what happens is they publish like 6 or 7 issues of one story, right? That's the Civil War. It's the main story, and it gets collected into an edition like this. This is Kingdom Come. It's like 4 or 5 different comics all put together, right? But it's all one cohesive story. But then what they did, which was actually really clever, in order to promote the other things, is they had all the other uh, comics running around, right? And they would say, "Hey, so Spider-Man has 3 issues during this, that's published during this time. Let's have these issues interlock, and then Captain America has these 3 issues. So what you have is great. You got a bunch of comics coming out, right? And each one is telling the same story, but from its own perspective. What are these characters doing during this time? What happened here?" And what they did was they used certain key events that you see in Civil War, the mainline title, right? Those events allowed you to tell where all the other comics sort of fit in. Because like one issue may actually take up 3 issues of Civil War, but you could have 3 issues of, like, say, the Fantastic Four that takes place between issue 3 and 4 of Civil War, right? So it allowed you to know where everyone fit in all these other backstories, and allows you to build it together. My point here is that's how Revelation is written. So you have your first, like I said, your first section is an introduction. Then you have your second section, which are the 7 letters. But then you have the rest of the book up until really chapter 19 in the Millennial Kingdom. And what's happening is we have 3 major points of view, 3 major sets of prophecies that are covering differing perspectives and differing time frames. That's the seals, the trumpets, and the vials. Intermixed, right, are these smaller events like Revelation 12, and which is the the woman who's pregnant and the dragon. And then we have all these other little events. Now most of those events are these sort of singular perspective events that happen outside of the order, right? It's like you have the 7 trumpets, that we're going to talk about some other things. We have the 7 seals, and we're going to talk about some other things. But within the trumpets, though, between 6 and 7, there's this whole interlude, right? And I would argue that's not a separate interlude. That's actually, it's there because we need to expand on that, because it occurs between the 6th and 7th. Again, we'll go into more detail. My point being here, though, is the book of Revelation is they're not nesting dolls. One does not necessarily truly come out of the other. What we're seeing are different things, right? Because the seals are prophecies, the trumpets are prophecies, but from a different perspective and a different time. And then there are other parts of this book where John's actually interacting with it. Again, the trumpets sort of lead into that, and then you have the bowls. So when we look at the book of Revelation, the problem is we try to create timelines by making it linear, and it isn't. And let me wrap up that idea with this. The book of Revelation is not linear in a traditional sense. It is moving from one part to the other, but the bowls, the seals, and the vials are 3 separate things, right? They're not in linear order. Now, like seal 1 does go before seal 2, which goes before seal 3. Like they are in chronological order together, but the 3 groups are not. Secondly, and this is sort of the last big controversial thing. Like I said, it's tied into that third key, and that is that the bowls are the only judgments in the book of Revelation. It is very common to hear pastors and theologians and evangelists and everyone talk about the trumpet judgments and the seal judgments. Here's the problem. The book doesn't call them judgments. Now, some people will say, well, but look at how terrible they are. Again, when we get into them, we'll dig into that more. But the point is, God clearly calls the bowl judgments, because he says, these are the vials of my wrath. These are the judgments. But the trumpets and the seals. Never once does God say, "These are my wrath, these are my judgments." He just doesn't. That has to be for a reason. Some people will say, well, because they're bad, we have to. No, we don't have to do anything. What we have to do beyond anything is take the Bible at its word. The Bible's the text means something. So if the text doesn't call it a judgment, we don't have any right to call it a judgment either. And the importance there is it changes our perspective as to what we're actually reading. Again, we'll talk about the rapture when we come to it. And the rapture is absolutely in the book of Revelation. It's just not where you think it is. But the simple fact of the matter is, we have created whole theologies around and interpretations of the book of Revelation under the concept that the seals and the trumpets are judgments. They're not. And if they're not judgments, then that changes the nature of what we're reading and what we're looking at and when certain things can occur. And that, again, that's a big deal. So let's go ahead and wrap up this episode. I wanted to be a little bit shorter, but I guess it didn't work out that way. By saying we're going to be studying the book of Revelation first. Eventually, we'll get to all the books, right? We've got nothing but time. But a lot of people, they know me for the book of Revelation and my prophetic works and, or works on prophecy, I suppose, and some other things. So this is always a big touchstone. So I thought we'd just start here. Next week, same place, same time. Hopefully YouTube will be streaming at the same time so we can do it all together. And of course, you can share, like, subscribe so you can see it coming in advance. We're going to have a lot of fun. But I think we're also going to dig into some things that you may not have ever heard, or not, at least definitely not from this perspective. And like I said, I want your comments. I would like to hear your questions. That's sort of the beauty of live stream, right? As if you watch it live, you can type in some questions and I can answer them as we go. And because this is not, for me, this is to have a broader conversation with more people. I think that if anything that people are learning is that we need to be using this opportunity, not just COVID in general, but the fact that we have this technology to talk to everyone around the world. We need to be looking for a higher form of discourse, right? We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing. We need to grow. We need to expand a little bit more. That's what this channel is going to be about. I look forward to speaking with you all again. And again, give me some questions. Love to answer them. Love to have some talks. We'll actually get into chapter 1. And honestly, as much as I love the book of Revelation, chapter 1 has, or the first couple chapters really, have some of my favorite material from a Jesus perspective, understanding who Jesus is. And you'll see why I believe that John at least finished his gospel after the events of the book of Revelation. Again, pretty much in chapter 1. So I'll see y'all next week. Again, Thursday, 7:30 to 8:30 Central Standard Time. And I hope God watches out for y'all. Let's pray for one another. Let's be there for one another. And let's just remember that everyone that you see, everyone that you meet, is someone that God loves. Even if you're not their biggest fan, God is their biggest fan. And he cares for them and he wants you to love them. And that means not just having happy thoughts about them. It means helping them out. It means bringing them to God. It means doing what's best and what's best for them, even if it costs you a little. All right. So as Bill and Ted used to say, be excellent to one another. We'll catch you next week.